You need to leave, old man. This is a restricted military training ground. The young Marine corporal barely glanced at the weathered figure standing by the fence, watching the massive Abrams tank struggle through yet another failed run. The elderly man said nothing, just shifted his worn cap and kept watching. If you believe respect is earned through action, not age, comment respect below. This is the story of George Bullman, and what happened next would leave an entire Marine unit standing at attention. George Bullman wasn't supposed to be there that sweltering July morning at Camp Pendleton. At 87 years old, most men would be content with their memories, tucked safely away in photo albums and war stories told to grandchildren. But George had received a call from an old friend, a retired colonel who mentioned in passing that the new recruits were having trouble with the tank qualification course. 3 weeks behind schedule. Morale sinking. Commanders frustrated. George hadn't said much on the phone, just asked for the training schedule and quietly driven his old pickup truck to the base, using a visitor's pass the colonel had arranged. The scene before him was chaos, barely contained by military discipline. The 68-ton Abrams tank lurched and stuttered through the obstacle course, clipping barriers, missing turns, grinding to a halt at sections that required precision timing and spatial awareness that seemed beyond the crew's capabilities. The young Marines were skilled, dedicated, but something fundamental wasn't connecting. They operated the beast with technical proficiency, but without the instinctive feel that separated competent tankers from exceptional ones. George watched their 5th failed attempt of the morning, noting every mistake, every hesitation, every moment where the crew fought against the machine instead of working with it. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to move back." A different Marine approached, this one a sergeant, younger than George's grandson. His tone was polite but firm, tinged with the frustration of another ruined run. George turned slowly, his faded eyes meeting the sergeant's with a calmness that seemed almost anachronistic in the tense atmosphere. "I can help," George said simply, his voice quiet but steady. The sergeant's expression shifted to something between amusement and pity. Behind him, other Marines had noticed the exchange, a few chuckles rippling through the group. An old man in civilian clothes, worn jeans and a shirt that had seen better decades, claiming he could solve what they couldn't. "With all due respect, sir, we appreciate the offer, but this is advanced armored warfare training, unless you have experience with M1 Abrams systems." The sergeant's words trailed off as George reached into his pocket, pulling out a small leather case. Inside was a faded military ID and a medal, its ribbon colors still visible despite the years. "Tank Commander, 3rd Armored Division, European Theater," George said quietly. "Drove Shermans through France and Germany. Different machines, same principles." The sergeant's smirk faded, replaced by uncertainty. An older officer, a captain overseeing the training, had walked over during the exchange, curiosity overtaking his skepticism. The captain studied George for a long moment, noting the way the old man stood, the way he carried himself despite his age. There was something in his bearing that couldn't be faked, a quality that transcended uniforms and ranks. "The Abrams is a different animal from World War II tanks," the captain said, not dismissively but testing. George nodded slowly. "Heavier, faster, more complex systems. But metal and momentum obey the same laws they did in 1944. And the ground doesn't care what year it is." Something in those words, the simple confidence without arrogance, made the captain pause. They were so far behind schedule, and conventional approaches had failed. What harm could there be in letting an old veteran watch from inside the vehicle? "All right," the captain said, making a decision he'd probably question later. "You can ride along in the commander's cupola. Observe only." George nodded his thanks, moving toward the tank with a purpose that belied his age. The young crew, 3 Marines barely into their 20s, exchanged glances as this elderly civilian climbed into their machine with surprising agility. The driver, a lance corporal from Nebraska, glanced back with barely concealed amusement. "No offense, Pops, but unless you've got a time machine, I don't think Sherman tactics are going to help with a digital fire control system." George settled into position, his weathered hands resting on the metal with unexpected familiarity. "Start your run," was all he said. They lurched forward, and immediately George saw the fundamental problem. The driver was fighting every input, overcorrecting, treating the massive tank like it was fragile. "Ease off your corrections," George's voice cut through the intercom, calm and clear. "She wants to move. Let her." The driver hesitated, then adjusted. "Third gear before the turn, not after. Trust your momentum." The loader snorted. "We've tried that. Tank's too heavy. We missed the marker." George's response was immediate. "You're thinking about the weight. Think about the flow. The course was designed by someone who understands how armor moves. Find the rhythm." His words were cryptic to them, frustrating even, but something made the driver try. They approached the chicane section, where tanks had to thread between concrete barriers in a tight S pattern. Every previous attempt had ended with scraped armor and failed times. "Commit to the turn earlier," George instructed. "Turn begins 50 feet before the first barrier, not at it. Your delay is what causes the clip." The driver wanted to argue, wanted to explain that the manual said otherwise, but something about the old man's certainty made him comply. The tank swung wide, earlier than felt right, and then, impossibly, threaded through the barriers with inches to spare. The gunner let out an involuntary whoop. The loader straightened in his seat, suddenly paying attention. "Again," George said simply as they completed the run. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than any attempt in 3 weeks. The captain stood outside with a stopwatch, his expression shifting from skepticism to focused attention. They ran the course again, and George's instructions became more specific, more instinctive. "Feel that vibration at 40 miles per hour? That's your sweet spot. The engine wants to run there." And, "Don't watch the obstacle. Watch where you want to be after the obstacle. The tank follows your focus." And, "Loader, shift your weight before the commander calls the target. You know it's coming. Move with the rhythm." The Marines began to understand. He wasn't teaching them to operate a tank. He was teaching them to become part of it. By the third run, they weren't just following instructions. They were beginning to feel what George meant. The massive Abrams stopped being a reluctant beast and became something fluid, powerful, almost graceful in its violence. They shaved 12 seconds off their best time. Then 18, then 27. Word spread through the training company. Other crews stopped their exercises to watch. The old man in the tank, the civilian who moved like he'd been born in armored steel. The laughter had died completely, replaced by something approaching awe. When they finally completed a flawless run, qualifying time beaten by 32 seconds, the crew sat in stunned silence inside the tank. George climbed out slowly, his age suddenly visible again in the careful way he descended. The captain approached, and behind him, the entire training platoon had formed up without being ordered to do so. "Who are you?" the captain asked, and it wasn't a question about name and rank. It was deeper. George adjusted his cap. "George Bullman. I drove tanks when they were death traps held together with prayers and welds. Lost 3 machines under me in Europe. Got my boys home each time because I learned that armor isn't about controlling the machine. It's about understanding what the machine wants to do and working with it." His voice carried across the silent group. "You're all better trained than I ever was. Better equipment, better support. But you were thinking too much and feeling too little." The captain did something then that wasn't in any regulation. He came to attention, and his salute was crisp, perfect, filled with genuine respect. Behind him, every Marine present followed suit. 40 men standing at attention for an old veteran who just taught them something they couldn't learn from manuals. George returned the salute slowly, his hand steady despite his years. For a moment, the decades fell away, and he was once again that young tank commander rolling through France, when the world was at war, and every day meant trusting your crew and your machine with your life. "Thank you for your service," the captain said quietly. George nodded once, acknowledging not just the words, but the respect that made them meaningful. What happened next spread through Marine Corps' armored divisions like wildfire. George Bullman's techniques, his philosophy of reading the machine and the terrain, became incorporated into training protocols. He was invited back not as a curiosity, but as an instructor, spending his remaining years teaching young tankers the art that existed beneath the science. He never took payment, just asked that they remember that every machine, no matter how advanced, still required a human soul that understood its nature. 3 years later, when George passed away quietly in his sleep, the funeral was attended by over 200 Marines, many in dress uniform, standing honor guard for a man who'd served his country in war and then served it again in peace by passing on wisdom that couldn't be coded or programmed. His techniques are still taught today, modified and updated for modern systems, but rooted in the same fundamental truth, that mastery comes from partnership with your equipment, not domination of it. Young Marines qualifying on Abrams tanks still hear the story of the old Sherman commander who showed up one day and reminded an entire generation that respect isn't given for age or rank alone, but earned through knowledge, skill, and the quiet dignity of someone who's walked the path before and offers to light the way. That sometimes the most advanced technology still needs the most ancient wisdom. Listen, feel, and trust what the machine is telling you. Subscribe to my channel if you believe that true mastery transcends generations, and that the greatest teachers are those who've lived the lessons they teach. Share this story if you know that respect is something earned through action, through the willingness to step forward when others step back, and through the quiet certainty that comes from experience turned into wisdom.